Hello, welcome to Straight Talk Africa, coming to you from my home in Arlington, Virginia, a suburb of Washington, D.C. I am Shaka Ssali, and today we reflect on the challenges of democracy in the world. According to a new report by Freedom House, the Washington-based research and advocacy group, nearly 75% of the world's population lives in countries where freedom is declining. VOA's White House correspondent, Patsy Wadakuswara, has more.
From Indian farmers' protests to clashes between law enforcement and supporters of Black Lives Matter. The world's two largest democracies, the United States and India, are part of a global trend showing a decline in democratic policies and institutions, according to the Freedom of the World 2021 annual report by Freedom House. The Washington-based think tank focuses on democracy and human rights around the world.
The pandemic has really exacerbated this long-term democratic decline. A lot of undemocratic leaders seized on it and used it as an opportunity to consolidate power.
Freedom House's report rates people's access to political rights and civil liberties in 210 countries and territories. In 2020, 45 more countries had declining scores compared to those with improving ones, a trend that has continued for the past 15 years.
Hands up! Don't shoot! Hands up! Don't shoot!
The United States is still considered free but fell 3 points since last year, a large drop for an established democracy and mostly driven by lack of transparency under the Trump administration.
One way this manifested was the dismissal of inspectors general and the undermining of other institutions that are meant to hold government leaders accountable. But the kind of second part of this is the pandemic. It really showed this disregard for transparency. The federal government and also some state governments propagated false or misleading information. They obscured pandemic-related data and just generally caused a lot of confusion and politicized the response.
This democratic erosion is not new. The U.S. has fallen 11 points in the past decade. Noting the siege of the U.S. Capitol by Trump supporters earlier this year, on Wednesday, Secretary of State Antony Blinken underscored the need to bolster democratic institutions.
Americans are increasingly polarized, and the institutions that exist to help us manage our differences so our democracy can continue to function are under strain. Shoring up our democracy is a foreign policy imperative. Otherwise, we play right into the hands of adversaries and competitors like Russia and China.
Less than 20% of the world population now lives in a free country, the lowest since 1995, according to Freedom House. India had the biggest drop since last year. Its status declined from free to partly free due to a multi-year pattern of Hindu nationalist policies and violence against Muslim minorities. Patsy Wadakuswara, VOA News.
Thank you, Patsy. Joining us are two distinguished guests. Dr. Yetunde Odugbesan-Omede, Professor of Global Affairs and Politics at Farmingdale State College in Long Island, in the northeastern U.S. state of New York, and Jon Temin, Africa Program Director at Freedom House in Washington, D.C. Well, I have to say, Yetunde and Jon, that I am profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the opportunity to host you on this special edition of Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you.
You're most welcome.
Nice to be here.
You're most welcome. So let me begin with you, Jon, perhaps appropriately, really. What was your immediate reaction when you basically looked at the report?
Well, Shaka, just as quick background, so we're talking here about the annual Freedom in the World report that my organization, Freedom House, puts out every year, which looks globally at every country and looks at how each country is doing in terms of democracy and freedoms, and a particular focus on human rights, especially across many countries. This is a global look that we do, and the global picture is a pretty difficult one, I have to say. This is the 15th straight year that we have recorded a global decline in freedoms. And so that means that for 15 straight years, more countries in our ratings have declined than have improved. And the gap between those this year was quite substantial. So it's a difficult time globally. I'll note as well that we look at the United States just like we look at every other country, and we have substantial concerns about the state of democracy in the United States. But turning to Africa, it was a difficult year in Africa as well, unfortunately. We recorded 21 countries declining in our ratings and only 7 of them improving. And that gap between the 21 declining, 7 improving is actually the largest gap that we've seen over that 15 years of global decline. So it's been difficult. There are some good stories, certainly. What happened in Malawi last year was a real bright light, and the transition in Sudan is another thing that we're paying close attention to, and that may well still succeed. But overall, a difficult year for democracy and freedoms in Africa as it was globally.
Could you kindly walk us through some of the most important or key reasons why the report is so bad, to the extent that the global democratic or global democracy trajectory has been declining?
And there's certainly a few themes that we see across Africa that resonate globally as well. One of which is the response to COVID-19. And we've certainly seen leaders who have used the cover of COVID-19 to crack down pretty broadly on their populations. Now, this is a difficult line for leaders to walk because certainly there are some justified restrictions that can be put in place in the interests of health. But I think there's some pretty clear examples of leaders who have gone well beyond what has been justified to really limit free expression, limit assembly, and that's had a really chilling effect in a lot of places. Of course, one of the big stories last year was term limits, and we saw in Guinea and Cote d'Ivoire in particular, leaders changing term limits in order to benefit themselves to serve third terms. And those two countries, especially Cote d'Ivoire, showed substantial declines in our ratings. Another thing that we pay a lot of attention to is digital authoritarianism and how authoritarian regimes are closing down digital space, shutting down the internet at certain times, blocking key websites, blocking social media. That's been another limitation on individual freedoms. So there's a lot of different factors at play. Those are some that jump immediately to mind and that we see happening in a number of countries.
Dr. Yetunde, what about you? Your reaction?
Well, it was quite disheartening just looking at the reports and sort of seeing where a lot of countries lie. We see examples even coming out of Nigeria. We see examples coming out of Burkina Faso and other countries in terms of just how fragile democracy is, really. A lot of the African countries oftentimes say that they are democracies, right? But they're pledging democracies. They're not full democracies, right? We see a lot of the human rights being challenged, and we don't see that in a sense on a decline. We see that in the past, the use of social media was there to shed a light on a lot of the human rights injustices that were going on. It was used to sort of hold leaders accountable and show the rest of the world what was going on in a specific country. However, for some reason, the leaders have been able to turn the table around by trying to, in a sense, diminish or question social media or technology altogether. They have been able to say, well, don't believe everything that you say, or that you see, or we need to crack down on social media because it's giving out false information. Whereas the information that have been provided, the videos that we have seen on various human rights injustice have just been able to reveal the drastic issues that are going on in the country. And so you see that in developed countries, you see that in developing countries, you see this narrative spreading globally across the world, and it's quite dangerous. Because if we don't have the civil society on ground, at least we have technology. Individuals have phones to record what is going on and to hold leaders accountable. But that is also being questioned and cracked down too. So then what alternatives or what instruments do people have to actually hold leaders accountable or shed a light on what's going on ground? So we have some real critical issues that we have to look at.
Jon, what about some critics who say that with the emergence of social media and the changing demographics, especially in Africa, one would have expected the democracy trajectory to improve rather than decline?
Well, there's certainly an argument to be made there. I think, building on what Dr. Yetunde was just saying, leaders are also using this new technology to go on the offensive. It's not just closing down internet and social media. It's also using that technology for spying and for surveillance and to try to get ahead of what some youth groups, some protest groups are doing in terms of trying to push their cause and to push for change. So the authoritarians learn as well. And that's something that we see globally, not just in Africa. So that side of the equation is not static. But I think you make a very important point, Shaka, in youth populations in particular that really are showing a great degree of frustration. In Uganda, a country you know very well, Shaka, we see a very large youth population, which is poised to be active, I think. You look at some of the protests that we're seeing right now in Senegal, and a lot of that is youth-driven. A lot of the protests that led to the revolution in Sudan were youth-driven as well. So that's a strong force, and leaders know that. And I think some leaders are doing a good job in trying to engage with youth populations and harness that for positive ends. But a lot of them are, I think, quite afraid, frankly, of their youth populations.
Dr. Yetunde, when you look at the current generation in tandem with social media, wouldn't you say, for example, that it is probably more than any other generation before it? It is much more informed than those of us who happen to be BBC, born before computers, or who actually happen to be the beneficiaries of what I would characterize as the Gutenberg factor, the printing press.
Oh, absolutely. With the emergence of globalization, with advanced technology, basically at our doorsteps, we have been able to engage in a way, strategically, I would use that word, engage in a way that generations before us have not been able to do. So I can be sitting here in New York and New Jersey and know exactly what's going on in Egypt or know exactly what's going on in the Middle East. I can connect with people who are leading movements and protests, and I can organize resources here to be available to them where they are, to provide them with the needs. So things have been shortened in time. The distance have been shortened. Resources have been more available to others that regardless wasn't there before. And we now see an insight into some of the issues that many people are going through in different countries. And I think that is what I think has changed things a lot. But even with the benefits of advanced technology and social media, we also see how that also can be used for bad, how that can be used against young people. And I always say that, look, Africa, as you know, has the highest population of young people, right, on the continent than any other continent. Now, when we look at this and when we sort of look at the metrics and we look at the data, the idea is that, okay, we have a generation of young people, yes, who are frustrated, who are graduating, who don't have, not seeing improvement in employment rates, who are not, in a sense, sitting in elected positions in a percentage that we would like. And that has an effect on the population. It has an effect on development. It has an effect on the economy. And so what do you do with a population who is just sitting, and it's almost like a ticking time bomb. If you are not preparing your country, in a sense, to have progressive policies that enable young people to find their footing, enable young people to reach their highest potential, then you are creating avenues for them that, in a sense, will have a bounce back on the country. If there is no way for them to get a job, they're going to go into deviant measures in order to sustain themselves and their families. A lot of these decisions oftentimes are survival-based decisions. They're decisions where I need money and this is an opportunity, whether it's good or bad, I'm going to take it. And so in a sense, you're just creating a horrible atmosphere and environment for the young people who are supposed to be our elected leaders by now, right? Who are supposed to be leading some of these countries by now and using that exposure, that global exposure that they have to bring the country forward. But we still see cases of electoral fraud, corruption, godfatherism, and all of these things that are still holding back this generation who desperately want to lead and who desperately want to change the course of tide for many of these countries.
Yetunde, what about the fact that most of Africa, you are talking about the state being the single largest employer, being the single largest contractor, to the extent that whoever is in control of the state is virtually almost in control of the population's oxygen.
Absolutely. That's the ingredients of authoritarianism. So I'm going to control the security, I'm going to control the economy, and that's it. So people are in a perpetual cycle of control, right? Fear and control, fear and control. And I think that is one of the ways in which authoritarianism just continues to exist and survive, which is why we have some of the longest running presidents ever in the continent, right? They have been able to use these two ingredients to sort of cripple the economy and also cripple the population from any form of movement or any form of speaking out to hold them accountable. And it's quite unfortunate. And I always say that, look, I don't know if I don't know if it's a ticking time bomb. I don't know if we've always been on that verge. Many countries have, and it has fallen over. They have tipped over or from fragile to failed, all of these different indexes. But my major concern, especially after seeing a lot of these protests, especially of recent, especially in Nigeria as well, right, with police brutality and all types of things that have global undertones, right? They're not peculiar to the continent of Africa. I'm very concerned about the future of the young generation as well, because at some point it may register to them that is what we're fighting for, this democracy that we're trying to even attain, is it even possible? Is it just a utopia? Is democracy just a word? Like, are we hiding behind this whole curtain of democracy when it's not even possible, right? So there's that battle of the fragility of democracy, and if it's even attainable, not even in an African country, but in the rest of the world, right? So we have real issues with this whole idea of democracy. Even here in the United States, we're not 100% full democracy, right? We fall short, right? We don't live up to our own, principles or our values of what we espouse to the world. And so what does that mean? It just means that we are living in imperfect democracies. And the question is, will we ever achieve the full democracy that we talk about?
And Shaka, if I can add one point to that, one thing that I'm particularly concerned about is whether citizens, and particularly young citizens, are going to continue to see elections as a route to change. Because some of the recent elections have been pretty difficult. And you look at the calendar of elections in Africa in 2021, and it's a difficult calendar in terms of expectations for free and fair elections.
Jon, if I might basically really inject myself in, would you really characterize those events, those periodic events, as periodic elections, or are they in fact, as some critics have suggested, selections that are meant for the incumbent?
It really does depend on the context, and it's case by case. But we see too many cases, for sure, of incumbents really putting a thumb on the scale and leaning on a process so that it is more of a selection event than a genuine election. And again, you know, I worry that citizens start to lose faith in those sorts of processes, and that would be a difficult place to be. And there's already some polling data that suggests that people are less inclined than they used to be to see elections as a route to change and elections as a route to improvements in their own lives. And so that leads to questions of sort of, if not elections, then how will people look for change? And, you know, in some countries that are deeply authoritarian, they have been able to mount peaceful protests that have in some cases been effective. But still, you know, in a well-functioning democracy, elections are that primary route to changing leadership and changing policies. And I worry about whether people are going to maintain faith in that.
John, there was, some would say, a great British Prime Minister by the name Sir Winston Churchill. He once suggested that democracy, as good as it may have been, was, in his words, the worst form of government except for the other ones. What exactly did he mean by that?
Well, hard for me to put myself in the shoes of Winston Churchill and speculate on what he meant. But what I'll say is that, you know, and I think we're seeing this in the U.S. as well, democracy requires continued work and continued maintenance. And, you know, democratic backsliding can happen pretty easily if people aren't maintaining the institutions of democracy and abiding by democratic norms. And so, you know, countries do not get to a state of democracy and just stay there. They have to keep trying to improve it and keep trying to maintain it. And certainly elections are not all that makes up a democracy. It's a relatively small part of democracy, but it's a part that gets a lot of attention. And, you know, I think we're seeing a lot of evidence of this in the democratic backsliding globally and in Africa. It takes work, it takes maintenance, and that's going to be essential going forward.
Dr. Yetunde, what about you? What did Sir Winston Churchill mean by suggesting that democracy, in his view, was the worst form of government except for the other ones?
I don't know how much weight he's putting behind the other ones now. The other ones is what we're actually having a conversation about, you know, but the question is, you know, you know, I think one of my students asked this question. He said, you know, should the whole world be a democracy? Is democracy a one-shoe-fit-all scenario, right? Should every country espouse to have democratic tenets? We have totalitarian, you know, governments. We have authoritarian governments. Should democracy be the form of government that should be adopted by all countries?
What about someone who would suggest, Yetunde, that yes, when you talk about democracy, you are pretty much looking at the democratic fundamental tenets that are universal?
Yes, that are universal. But there's also a critique to democracy, meaning the sort of the historical context of how democracy, in a sense, was sort of put together. So if we look at a lot of the multilateral institutions, if we look at the United Nations, if we look at the World Trade Organization, if we look at the IMF, if we look at the ICC, we look at multilateral global organizations that, in a sense, have the underpinnings of spreading democratic ideals, right? There's a sense that there's a pushback from countries who believe that democratic ideals don't fall in line with their own cultural, religious background. Many countries that are founded on, that are theocracies, right? There are certain things that in democratic underpinnings and in their value systems that literally go against some of their ideas on how they would like to run their country, whether it's cultural, whether there's some cultural basis to it, whether there's religious tenets to it. And there's a pushback against that and say, look, you guys, you want to sort of implement Western ideals or Western democracy into our lives and our fabric. But like you said, Shaka, it's supposed to be a universal thing. And so when we talk about democracy, oftentimes we talk about it from our westernized viewpoint, right, of what we understand democracy to be, right, what we understand fundamental human rights to be, and how that came into creation. But at the same time, there's also a pushback against that. So how do we balance the individuality or the autonomy, of course, of countries, and understand their culture, but in a sense, how their culture also infringes on the human rights of others. You understand what So it's a delicate balance to me, and I've seen that balance sort of in fraud or intention in a way, where countries are trying to hold their own ideals, and some of their ideals may infringe on the human rights of their population. But again, it's based on some of their religious values. And so we sometimes come in, or Western countries come in and say, no, this is not right, or this is not the way that it should be. And they said, well, I'm a sovereign country. It's my country, right? I'm leading this population. This is how we want to govern. And so we have those things, and I'm sure that at some point, countries will understand some of the benefits of democracy and are able to find that balance, that delicate dance.
But Yetunde, is there such a thing as democracy regardless of culture, if in fact there is no such a thing as accountability, if there is no such a thing, for example, as justice, if there is no such a thing as fairness in any culture, any geographical location on this planet Earth?
The interesting thing, too, that we also have to keep in mind is that what makes a democratic country democratic, right, is the underpinnings of law and justice. It's the foundation of the Constitution. Whenever a Constitution is either manipulated or overridden by religious theory as well, you run into issues. Because here, or in other countries where democracy is really, really, in a sense, sometimes the priority, I would say, or the major focus of how the government wants to be run, we are bound by rule, law, justice, and the Constitution, right? So the Constitution, that is the I would say the head of the country, right? In other countries, it's a religious tenet that supersedes the Constitution, right? So you may have Sharia law, you may have. That's what I'm saying, that yes, accountability, rule, law, and justice are the underpinnings of a constitution, of a democracy. But what happens in countries where the Constitution is not the underpinning of what they call their own democracy?
Now, Jon, traditionally, it is some key Western countries that have promoted democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And lately, one would say there seems to have been a sort of democracy fatigue in the West. And some could probably even add a sort of democracy that essentially the West has become complacent in as far as democracy is concerned since the Berlin Wall failed. Since the Berlin Wall fell about 30 years ago, that the West felt that it was triumphant, democracy was the way to go, and the Soviet Union, of course, collapsed. Is it possible that it is due to complacency, due to some sort of democracy fatigue, that we are here where we are now? You could see, of course, what happened in the recent presidential elections in the United States, and you know what happened on January 6th.
I think you can call it more than complacency or fatigue. I think you can call it democratic regression or backsliding, and we've documented that in the United States in our Freedom in the World reports, and we're documenting it elsewhere. And as I mentioned before, these are institutions, these are systems of government that require constant work. And I think there is an argument that many people have taken their eye off the ball in terms of doing that work and in terms of shoring up the underpinnings of democracy in a number of countries. And some of the backsliding that we're seeing now is a result of that. But, authoritarianism and authoritarians were never going to go away quietly. They too have learned, and they too are willing to go to a lot of extremes to maintain their hold on power, in part because authoritarians out of power face a dismal future in many places, and they don't want them to be themselves to be, suffering the same treatment that they hand out when they are in power.
We'll take a short break, so please don't go away, because we'll be right back with you.
Health, wellness, sport, beauty, medical breakthroughs. Healthy Living cares about your well-being. What are the main health concerns in Africa and around the world? Find out the latest on coronavirus. Connect with our experts and ask them questions.
How long does the virus stay?
Join me, Linor Moudou, in Washington, every week on Healthy Living, right here on VOA.
Hello, welcome back to Straight Talk Africa. We are talking about the challenges facing democracy in the world. My distinguished guests are Yetunde, Odugbesan-Omede, Professor of Global Affairs and Politics at Farmingdale State College on Long Island in New York, and Jon Temin, the Africa Program Director at Freedom House. In the spirit of the state being the single largest employer and the state being the single largest contractor, what about autocrats who tell their people that what you really need is service delivery? It is not democracy, that you cannot eat democracy. Is it possible that service delivery and democracy are mutually exclusive, or are they in fact mutually reinforcing?
Well, there's of course this argument out there that it takes a strong man in order to grow the economy, in order to build up a country, and some people make some reference to growth in Asia some time ago to buttress that argument. But I think that the recent data on that argument is pretty questionable. And I think at the end of the day, what's so important in a democracy is the feedback loop between people and their governments. And that comes through elections, and that comes through processes like taxation. People need to be seeing services from their government, and they need to have an opportunity to either vote that government in or vote that government out. And when I get concerned is when that feedback loop doesn't exist. And when there's such a detachment between the government and its citizens. And with democratic backsliding in so many places, we're seeing that gap between citizens and their government grow. And we're seeing expectations of government diminish, and some people get into a place where they never expect very much from their government because they're used to their government not really delivering much in terms of services. And that's a tough place to be. A lot of the roots of that also come from countries that are so resource dependent. And we see quite a number of them in Africa, because when your revenue comes from oil, comes from other sorts of extractives, you're not dependent, the government, on taxation. You're not dependent on the government, on people sort of buying into the government through taxation. And that just adds to that distance between government and the people, and it makes governments even less accountable.
What about you, Dr. Yetunde?
Yeah, I think in terms of just when we think of the service delivery, we can just really go back to sort of David Easton's model of really the feedback loop and really trying to understand what are some of the issues on ground, and with that information, creating policies that address a lot of these problems. But what we see is that many of the services that are delivered, especially even by the government, are in a sense non-existent, or individuals have to rely on themselves or rely on civil society, on organizations to step in the gap of what the government is supposed to provide. So yes, they can espouse that, okay, we need to just focus on service oriented, but what are the services that are actually being provided that has helped the population out of poverty or out of low employment or lack of infrastructure? There are a lot of things, and the continent, in a sense, is so rich, just in resources and population and innovation and ingenuity, and I think in everything positive, but yet it's not continuously tapped into by the government. It's tapped into outside external bodies that have not really been to the benefit of the population. And I hope that at some point, new leaders can emerge. I would say that new leaders, not recycled leaders, not leaders who used to lead before, who continuously try to still run and have their shot at politics, but really new, fresh breath of a new leader that can come in and bring some fresh ideas, so some innovative ways on how to move the country forward. I think that's what really is needed on the continent: fresh new ideas, new leadership. And we're not saying that just because you are young, you are just fit to lead. What we're saying is that the generation that we have now have a level of exposure that previous generations did not have. And this comes with some form of added benefit. In addition to that, they are able to sort of compare and contrast many of the issues that are going on in their countries and in other countries. They're easily able to look at what are some of the best practices that other countries that are doing that can be implemented in this country. What are some of the practices that may need to, be gone away with, that can move the country forward? It's just a different level, I think, of thinking that recycled leaders have failed to sort of implement and do, right? So we're not seeing any growth in that regard. And if there's no growth in leadership, if there's no change in some form of baton that's being passed, then we're going to continue seeing the same problems over and over again. And I think that's the cycle that many of the African countries are sort of stuck in.
When you talk about leadership, Yetunde, and you talk about new leaders, how would those new leaders come to the surface? You are talking about most countries on the African continent hold elections, which, as some pundits suggest, are in fact selections, because the results of those type of events do not reflect the will of the voter or the will of the people, really. They reflect the will of the individual who announces the results, or the will of the individuals who count the votes. And those individuals have in fact been appointed by somebody who happens to be an incumbent president or prime minister of the day.
Yeah, so that's why I said the issue of godfatherism. And so what happens is that we could talk about this issue of why we don't have new leaders basically in the government for many of the reasons that you have stated. But at the same time, there has to be some form of change, right? If we're saying that the basis and the underpinnings of democracy is free and fair elections, right? We have seen some fresh people come in and run, but unfortunately, in countries that operate under single party mechanisms, right, and it's not a multi-party, most opposition parties are oftentimes silenced. Most young people, or not even, let's not take young, new leaders that do emerge, who do want to run against the status quo, who do want a new change for their country, oftentimes are, of course, seen as opposition and are, in a sense, rooted out, right? So we still have that issue that elections are not necessarily free and fair, right? We still have the issue that selection processes do happen. And most importantly, we have the issue that anytime there's someone new who does come in, or there is an existing person who continues to rule, the manipulation of the Constitution continuously occurs. And so it's so many issues that are attacking this one major issue of what we're trying to solve. And it's like you solve one here, but there are 10 others to the right that still need to be addressed. And I don't want to sound hopeless because I do think that the future of Africa is very bright. I do think that there are amazing, innovative people who are on that continent who are just as hopeful to see a new dawn in their country. And I do believe it will come to fruition. But oftentimes, when we do want some change, we either see a revolution or we see people who are losing their lives to actually bring to birth the things that we are talking about. So it's not going to be an easy road, to be honest.
You talk about the issue of one-party state, but you do not address the issue of the multi-party facade. Because what has really happened, we no longer have those traditional quote-unquote one-party state. What we have today are essentially, at least on paper, a multi-party system that is operating essentially like on a one-party template.
Yeah, I do agree with you in that sense. I do agree with you in that sense, and these are one of the issues of why we have these sort of countries today, why we have these sort of governments set up today, and why we don't, in a sense, have the progression that we are looking for, and why we have leaders who have been running countries for more than 30 plus years. These are the characteristics of what has created the environment on ground.
Jon, what about, some critics who say that essentially, with a few exceptions on the African continent, the sort of elections or selections that are being conducted and organized are really organized not in favor of the primary stakeholders of those countries, but rather they are organized for the development partners who provide the aid. Any evidence from some of the reports that you have churned out so far?
Let me make a couple of points, Shaka. One, I just want to go back a little bit to the conversation that's been happening in terms of election, because there actually has been a healthy number of leadership changes in Africa in the last 5 or 6 years. There's certainly some of those leaders who have been around for decades and are showing no sign of going anywhere. But since 2015 or so, there's actually been a good number of changes at the top of governments. I think more than half of the countries have different leaders now than they did in 2015. But the larger question is whether the systems of governance are changing and whether new leaders who come in are really just perpetuating a same often exclusionary system. Look, for example, at Zimbabwe, where President Mnangagwa came in promising a new dawn and a different dispensation compared to President Mugabe. And fair to say that hope is gone, and Zimbabwe has been run in the same authoritarian manner, if not worse. But there actually has been a decent amount of that leadership change, not necessarily to some of the younger generations, as we've been discussing.
Yeah, but Jon, are you in a position to name names really? Because we're talking about 54 African countries. It becomes 55 when you talk about membership of the African Union. How many sort of changes are you talking about here? There are not many Malawis.
There are a number of countries.
There are not many Seychelles.
Yeah, no, those are certainly a couple of the stories that stick out. But there are a number of countries that have had new leaders come in, but are they really new in terms of generation and in terms of policies?
More of the same, from the same parties that have ruled those countries for decades.
Well, the jury is still out on some. Take, for example, the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. President Tshisekedi is trying to make a break from his predecessor, President Kabila, and trying to make some reforms, and it's very tenuous. But that's just another example of where there could be some change and there could be some movement, but we'll see.
But how do you expect a man like Felix Tshisekedi to make changes really, when in fact for all practical purposes, you are looking at a man who has a title, who has a rank, but with no authority? He neither has a political base nor a military base.
Well, I'm not sure that's the case anymore. I mean, that was true 6 months ago, and it was true a year ago. But if you follow what's been happening in the DRC recently, he has done what most consider an impressive job of marginalizing former President Kabila and putting more of his people in place and taking over the reins of government. Now, what he will do with that and whether he can deliver for the Congolese people is a huge question that remains to be seen. But when you look below the surface there actually are some changes going on. Shaka, to your question just a moment ago on the imposition of elections from the West, I think a lot of the answer to that needs to go back to some of the polling data that we have in Africa in terms of support for democracy. And that polling data, and I'm referring largely to Afrobarometer data here, is still pretty positive in terms of people preferring democracy as compared to other systems of government. It has weakened a little bit in recent years, but only a little bit. And the numbers in Africa are still relatively strong compared to other parts of the world. So certainly we do see a lot of Western and other support for democracy, and some people see that as meddling. But African views on their own are still pretty strong in support of democracy as a form of government.
To what extent would you say, Yetunde, that part of the problem of institutionalizing democracy in Africa is perhaps precisely because some of the key countries in the West, which were in the business of promoting democracy, are in fact some of the countries that have really undermined that principle. I am looking, for example, in the 1990s, during the Bill Clinton administration, where they identified what they said were the beacons of hope for African democracy, where they identified some individuals as a new breed of African leaders. And we are talking about Isaias Afwerki. We are talking about Eritrea. We were talking about Meles Zenawi, Ethiopia. We are talking about Yoweri Museveni Tibuhaburwa, Uganda, and Rwanda, where you have a Major General Paul Kagame. Is there democracy in any of those countries that I have mentioned so far?
Well, okay. Look, countries in a sense, if we look, Western countries in general are going to have their own self-interest at hand, right? And that's why I always say that there's a delicate balance with the ideas of democracy and why there are countries who do push back against its tenets due to its Western foundation, in a sense. So there are countries who believe that when we talk about democracy and the emergence of democracy, that really the architects of democracy are also, in a sense, the architects of colonialism. They also, in a sense, were the architects of neo-colonialism. And so when we talk about democracy in the way that it's universal, in which I believe that democracy is extremely important because of what it espouses and the freedoms that it gives to people to be their highest self, right, and to be protected. But at the same time, we also have to look at the historical context of the emergence of the spread of democracy in general and why there is such a pushback, because those who have espoused democracies and who have tried to sort of spread this whole idea of this government to many other countries have did it in forceful manners, have did it behind closed doors, have put people in position who do not espouse democratic values, but only are there to provide some backdoor avenue to exploitation and plundering, and access to other Western countries into their country, where they are either getting paid or getting some form of individual compensation for opening their country up. So there's just a lot of different things, and like I said, a lot of the architects of many of these institutions that we see that are supposed to espouse democratic tenets have indeed created policies that have put African countries in a developmental delay, right? So we're talking about structural adjustment programs. If we're talking about different trade regulations that have happened, so there is cause, of course, for concern and for criticism and for alarm. But that still does not negate the fact that leaders still need to be held accountable, right? They still need to be held accountable to their population and to their people, right? They have more than enough knowledge to understand the historical context, to understand how countries are self-interest at the end of the day, to not be able to look at their own interests and not be able to separate those interests from the interests of their people and what they have been put in position to do. So regardless of the fact, regardless of the historical context, regardless of the issues that lay on the ground, these leaders still need to be held accountable. They still need to do what is in the best interest for themselves and for their country. And oftentimes we're not seeing that. And this is why we're seeing high levels of corruption.
Professor Yetunde, take me to class. Let's assume that I am in your politics 101.
Okay, I'm teaching that right now.
And we are talking about democracy.
Mm-hmm.
What is democracy really? Abraham Lincoln, for example, once said that democracy, in his view, was a government of the people, by the people, for the people. And yet, there are some critics who say that what they have observed in majority of African countries as democracy seems to be, in their view, not mine, a government of some people, by some people, and for some people. What is democracy really?
Look, when we look at democracy, democracy is a representation of the people, right? When Lincoln said for the people, by the people, that is really the tenets of democracy, where people can peacefully, in a manner, be able to change those who are in elected capacity to represent their needs and concerns in the most just way. There are other things that come with it, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, the ability to live up to your own highest potential. But really, it's being represented by the people. And so that's why when we talk about free and fair elections, it still goes back to that direct representation of the people. And once that is flawed, and once that is manipulated in any way, easily we can say that that is a fragile democracy. Easily we can use that statistic or that meter to say, okay, this is a democracy that has an issue, or it's a fragile democracy, it's a fragile state, or a failed state. These are the things that we can use as a measurement capacity of democracy. I think those are one of the first things that we actually, in a sense, look at, is the electoral process. And so from the electoral process, we can also devise and be able to look at many other things that are also happening within that state, right? So is it the freedom of expression, right? The right to assemble, religious freedom. So we can look at all of those different mechanisms and see how free they are, in a sense. And I think Freedom House does that in terms of coming up with their data, and it comes of coming up with their capacity, because that's, in essence, that is how we have to rate and see democracy. And I want Jon to sort of interject in this, because these are the ways in which we look at what countries are free or not. And those are the main, I believe, characteristics.
Jon, in your report, it suggests that when you have democracy, you have prosperity. You have a friendly environment where, for example, investments can be made. You have the possibility of peace and stability. Any particular reason why anybody would not want to embrace democracy then?
Certainly in non-democratic systems, there can be a small number of people who benefit enormously from that, especially financially, especially when corruption is rampant, and they can be very reluctant to give up those spoils that accrue to them and to people who are close to them and to their communities. But I think democracy, as much as anything else, is about the opportunity for equality and equitable sharing of resources. And a healthy democracy has checks and balances in place to, we never reach perfection, but to move closer towards perfection in terms of how resources and opportunities are shared. And let me just add, Dr. Yetunde makes a very good point, in terms of what we do in our Freedom in the World report, because we're not just rating governments. We are rating the freedoms that people enjoy on a daily basis. And that has a lot to do with how the government performs and the rules that the government sets out, but it's far more than just that. And so that is an important piece of what we do to keep in mind.
And you, of course, talk about the right for an individual to own an opinion, for example, an opinion that may not necessarily be on the same page with the government in power. You talk about freedom, of course, of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of worship, and freedom of the media.
Absolutely. These are all factors that we're looking at, and these are places where we see some weakening. And that includes, as I was saying at the top, in relation to COVID. We've seen some countries cracking down on media and other things, again, sort of under the guise of COVID response, but it's hard to give that too much credibility.
Professor Yetunde, what would you say to me if you were to talk to me from the deepest, better part of the bottom of your Nigerian heart and soul? What is the way forward for Africa and for democracy?
One, we need to start with the justice system. Everyone should be afforded equal justice under the law, equal representation, and we don't see that. So what that then breeds is a whole Pandora box of issues. When you cannot trust your security apparatus in the country, where you cannot trust the judges who are put into position to make decisions on behalf of your independence or of any cases that are happening, when you do not trust the government. So there's an eroding that happens. And that eroding then leads to other issues. So once we sort of look at the issue, I think, of law and justice, I think that is a bedrock when we talk about democracy. And once that is fragile, then we have a whole lot of issues that come out of that.
Jon, you have the last word.
I think particularly when leaders change term limits to benefit themselves, that should be the kind of treatment that they face. And we should treat that somewhat like when a coup happens, because I think that is in some ways a constitutional coup, you may call it, because they are changing the rules, often with a huge thumb on the scale, to benefit themselves. That kind of response to bad elections in Africa needs to be led by other African countries. And we have not always seen strong regional responses to elections that are pretty clearly flawed.
Well, Yetunde and Jon, I have to say that it has been a pleasure once again to have the opportunity to have this conversation with you.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you
so much.
Thanks to our audience for tuning into Straight Talk Africa. In the meantime, get better, not bitter democracy. And please, please remember to keep the African hopes alive.